Hi and welcome to this video in the QPSMR CATI up and running series. And in this video we're going to be looking at setting up a questionnaire for telephone interviewing and to actually carry out the telephone interviewing and some of the things you have to do to manage that project. Now, to get us just up to speed on where we're coming in on this particular video. In previous videos, we've looked at creating a sample file and setting up our quotas for the project. So that's all been done at this point in the survey I have here. And just as a sort of little reminder of where we are with that, I can go into the supervisor function, I can go into quota control, and I can view my quota file. Here it is, just open it up. And that tells me that for this particular survey, I'm looking to get 70 interviews, 50 are members, 20 are non-members, 50 attended an event, and 20 did not attend the event. So that's just 70 people from 2 different questions. And we can see that in our sample file here, they've been called as sample and quota at the member question and the event question. So we can control which respondents we get in our sample. We've also created the sample file. In a previous video, we looked at turning a spreadsheet of respondents or potential respondents with telephone numbers into a sample file that can be used for conducting the interviews. So now we're going to actually get this ready to distribute to the interviewers so they can actually do their work, and we need to go through a few steps to achieve that. So the first thing we need to do as a supervisor, first of all, and in this video I should say I'm going to actually play 2 roles, because I'm going to play the role of a supervisor and the role of an interviewer. So at the moment I'm the supervisor, and I'm going to make a file that the interviewers can use so that they can actually carry out their work. So let's go and set up an interview, and the first thing I need to do is to either give it a title if I want to. I can replace that. Click on telephone, that's the first thing to do. I want to issue serial numbers. I'm going to get my sample from a particular file, that one that was created in the previous video. So I'm going to browse. I'm going to find my sample file. There it is. I'm going to use the quotas that I showed just now in the quota file, where we have 50 members and 20 non-members and so on. And I'm going to choose my data file, which should be project action, which is the name of this project, and you should call it main.asc for the file name. So add that space and then main.asc. So I'm going to store this as local files, and I'm going to save it. And this will invite me to make a QIF file that we'll be distributing to each of the interviewers. Now I've already got one here, so it's just going to overwrite that now. And click OK, and it's confirming that we're actually ready to go and distribute this to my interviewers. So let's now come out of this project, because I've now finished with it, although the supervisor would typically stay connected. And this is the file that I would distribute to the interviewers, the QIF file, and it's the one that the interviewers would be using. Now the interviewers would be using the Telin software to conduct the interviews. You can conduct interviews through the full QPSMR CATI program. That would be perhaps something that just supervisors or perhaps senior interviewers might use, but typically an interviewer would open up a QIF file through Telin software, so they would need to have Telin installed on their machine so that they can do that. So I'm now playing the role of an interviewer, and I'm going to double click on the QIF file, and that should open up the Telin program. There we are, you can see it's opening up, and I'm presenting with a screen showing what I can do. And the first thing you might notice up here is that we want 70 more interviews. So that's confirming that we want 70 interviewers. If you want, or the supervisor wants an interviewer to conduct interviews with a particular part of the sample, we could say that I only want this interviewer to only interview non-members. So that would mean there's only 20 people now that this interview has got to do or needs to do. And I could do that within did not attend, and actually it's still 20 people. Or I could do that within members, and I've got 50 to do here and 20 to do here, because it was just that both had 50-20 splits for those two criterion. And that tells me down here how many records in my sample file are available. So if I wanted members, I wanted 50 members and 20 who did not attend the event, the two questions that are controlling the quotas I'm trying to reach, there's actually only 10 records in the sample file that meet that criteria, which of course means in this particular case to achieve those targets of 50 and 20, it would be necessary to add new sample records so that those targets could be reached. But there's no reason not to start interviewing before you have the full sample ready. That's perfectly okay. Obviously you mustn't run out of sample, otherwise you can't actually conduct those interviews. So we're now ready to actually work with this project as an interviewer. So I'm now going to click on the, one thing worth saying here is if you leave this open for a long period of time, other interviewers may be collecting records and this number might go down. So if it's unattended for some time, refreshing is a good idea. And if there were some interviews conducted on another computer, that would drop to 49, 48 or whatever it might be, indicating the actual number still needed for collection. So that's really when a computer's been left unattended. An interviewer can see what quotas we're trying to achieve, so that's just something that tells us that we're trying to get 50-20, 50-20, but there's been none saved yet. And again, you can refresh that if that has been left unattended for some time to get the latest figures in there. So if we're ready to start interviewing, we can click on the sample button here, and that pulls a record from the sample. There's only 10 records from the type of interviews I'm trying to conduct here, and we now can proceed with this. If we haven't got an automated dialing system in place, we would need to click the interview button. But if you have, of course, you could actually just get it to dial, and if you had a dialer on there, or if you were using the WinSock function, you could use that. But we haven't got that here, so I'm just going to click on interview, and that should take me into the beginning of the interview. So just a few things about this. So this is just a text only question, so I'm going to read that out, and I'm going to click next here to move on to the next question. And you'll see here something that's highlighted, that if you want to break the interview at any point, you can just hit the F12 or the function 12 button on the keyboard, and that will allow you to break the interview. That's typically used where you want to continue later because the respondent perhaps wants to make an appointment, either perhaps at the beginning or perhaps even halfway through an interview, even says after maybe doing 6 or 7 questions, look, I'm busy now and I'd like to complete the interview at a later stage. Now, to get through this interview in the setup of the questionnaire, everybody needs to have said yes here. So if I click no, you'll see that immediately I'm not eligible. So it just says interviewer not eligible, respondents not complete the criteria. So that's a fixed piece of text that's been put into the setup of the questionnaire, and this interview is now rejected. And so we would save that as a failed interview or not eligible interview, and it would not be asked again. You can see now that I've only got 9 of these types of people left, people who fit the criteria of member and did not attend the event. So I've only got 9. If I want to get back to the full sample, I can just turn these off, and I've now got access to the 29 that are remaining in the sample file. So if I'm ready to go, I can carry on again. So let's click on the sample file here, and let's conduct an interview with this particular person. Let's get a bit further this time. So now we've got to this particular question. They are willing to participate, and they must answer this question. Now, what that means is where you see that sign saying must answer the question, this is a question that you can't just jump past. There is an F5 key that will let you jump past a question, but we're not letting the interviewer jump past because this is fundamental to the quotas. Remember, this is one of the questions where we had to know whether they attended or didn't attend the event, so we don't want them going F5 past this. So we're going to say they attended. Would you like to attend next year? Let's say yes, definitely. And we can start to move through the questionnaire. Now, we could, of course, at this point, decide that we don't want to complete the interview now, or the respondent might decide that. We've only got as far as question 3. If I want to get out the interview, I can just hit the F12 button, and you can see that I can continue this at a later date. So I can continue later. And when I do that, I have a choice now of what I do in terms of setting this up. It can be a vague soon, later, tomorrow. We can actually fix an actual appointment. So I could say, well, I'd like the interviewee would like to be contacted tomorrow, and that might be at a certain time. So we might want to set that at 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. And we might want to allow a delay of maybe up to 8 minutes on that. And then we can set the priority over here as to whether it's low, medium or high important. It defaults to low importance. And over here you can see we can also set this to be anybody who's available at that time to make the call, or if it's a particular interview that you want to ascribe to that interviewer, or perhaps that the interviewer has perhaps managed to have some rapport with the interviewee. The interviewee said, well, I don't mind being called again tomorrow as long as it's you that calls me. You could click on me, or if you're not available tomorrow, you could click that someone else should be doing that and choose from a drop-down list of the interviewers which person actually conducts that call. You can change these figures here, up here, by clicking on the minutes. So I've clicked on the minutes here, which has picked up that radio button, add 15 minutes on, and that now becomes an 8:15 interview tomorrow evening up to 2023 because we're allowing a delay of up to 8 minutes. I can look at the history of this respondent if I want to, and it just tells me that the interview did proceed at the beginning. When someone connects again tomorrow, they'll see that history if they want to see it and know that that person was contacted at that particular time today. If that's all we want to do, we can now click OK, and that interview is effectively put aside as described in the initial video in this series. So it's put aside so that it's retaken, if you like, from the sample file at the appropriate time tomorrow, and we can click OK on that. And that's the end of the appointment, and we can just read out, thank you for your help so far. Someone will call you back at 20:15. Goodbye for now. I click next, and that's the end of that interview. And you can see now we're ready to go again. We've lost another person in our sample. We've got 28 now that are available at this moment. And so again, we've got our sample back being managed correctly. If there are other interviewers here working alongside me, that would drop to 27, 26, and so on. So before we do another successful interview or a successful interview, let's just look at one or two more things that can happen. So let's click on the sample. Let's get another person here. We can see they've had no calls. We click on the interview button. We say good afternoon. They agree to participate, and they did attend the event. And we can continue here, picking answers, but maybe at some point they decide that they don't want to complete the interview. So perhaps at this point here, they say, look, I didn't realize it was going to be as long as this. I really don't want to continue. You offer an appointment for the next day, or whatever. They don't want that. There's no other way out, unfortunately, here now, but they're not going to take part in your survey. They're going to remain as a partially completed record, and they will go to a partial file. So they'll go to the file called Project Action partial.asc, but we're not going to be able to get any more data from them. And if we click F12 here, they don't want to continue later. They actually want to terminate the interview. which means that we have to code that. And here we are. Here's a code here, refusal to continue. And it's effectively now a dead interview. And that completes the end of the interview. And again, a message comes up to thank them for their time and goodbye. So that interview also failed. It got partially through the questionnaire, but there was no hope, unfortunately, on that case of that person or that respondent being willing to continue at a later date. Again, we can take another record now. We have another interview. Now this time perhaps we can have a failure. Perhaps the call doesn't connect for some reason. So we can click on a failure button here and we can give the reason for the failure. It might be because there's no reply, in which case we would try again the next day or a later point to try. So we could click no reply, and that would mean we leave it as sample. And so it's still in there, but it's not in the fresh anymore. It's gone down one by the fresh, but it's still left in the sample file to be recalled. So we can try another one. Let's get another record here. Get one from the sample. And we might fail for another reason this time. So whereas there we had no reply, we might have a refusal by respondent, which means that effectively that's the end of that potential interviewee. We could have unobtainable, which is presumably the end of it again if the number doesn't ring at all. So we might want to click it as dead, and that again would remove it from the sample file. So we've looked at various scenarios there where you can have a potential respondent that doesn't carry on, and we've looked at a partial interview where someone's going to be called back at a later time. So we can look at appointments here. We can see we've got 2 appointments, and we could list any we've got in the next 2 days, for example. So there they are. Here's 2 particular respondents who we can go back to, and we can get their details if we want to, and we can see who they are. So we can look at those and see who we've got possible as potential respondents in the future. Well, I think it's now time to go through and complete a survey. So let's just look at the practicalities of doing that. So let's get another record from the sample. Let's interview this one, and this time hopefully we'll have a more successful interview. So let's click yes. Let's click attended. Maybe. If it's a multi-coded question, it has the word multi here, so it's a good idea to teach your interviewers to look for that. That means then that they can click more than one answer or as many answers as they want to. Of course, if it had a none of these here that was a single response only, they wouldn't be able to do that as well. Click OK, and then we can start answering the questions in this questionnaire. So we proceed through the questionnaire, giving the answers. This one's single, so if I click another answer, it just changes it. If it had the multi button here, of course I could choose more than one. And you can see there's some dynamic text coming through here that the interviewer can read out. Having selected Rover at the previous one, I can now click on that and that because it's got a multi button. How long? How often do you change your car? I can type in 2. Average income. Can you estimate these figures? Now this particular part of the questionnaire is going to check that this has to 100%, so I might type in 20 here. You can use the number pad rather than clicking on the buttons here. The number pad on the computer. 40. And if it should have another 40 here to make it add up, let's put 41. And you can see I get an error message here so that it's clear to the interviewer that it should add to 100%, but we've got 20, 40 and 41. I click OK. I can choose to ignore that warning. I'm going to say no. I'm going to correct it to 40, and I should be able to proceed now on to the next question. This one's a multi again with the answers randomized. So as I read those out, and I've completed a successful interview, and read out the appropriate message at the end and save that. And now, sure enough, I have got a saved questionnaire. If I come out of this now and I go back into my role as supervisor, I can open up the project in QPS MR CATI. And as the supervisor now, I can start to look at the how my quota's going. Of course, that could be done concurrently. I could say I could start to, but actually, obviously, the supervisor will be watching what's going on with the interviewer, and we can see here that we've got some saved records already, and we need another 19 in each of these particular samples still. So I've started my project and I've now got some data in here, and that will obviously update as required from time to time and as interviewers start collecting more records. Well, that's taken you through the principles of preparing the questionnaire so that you can distribute it to your interviewers. It already assumed this video that you had the sample and the quota prepared, and if you haven't or you don't know how to do that, that's covered in a previous video. And we've looked at some of the, or most of the, different things that an interviewer will encounter when they're looking to get another record in for sample, and what might happen if that interview fails, or there's a partial interview or partial interview with a callback, and what happens, of course, if you go through a successful interview to the end. Well, I hope that was all useful. There's another video in this series that shows how a supervisor can actually get some reports from the surveys that have been conducted, but that's the end of this video now. Thank you for joining me.